Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Everybody suffers. We just do. Whether we have too much credit card debt, student loans that will never pay off, underemployment, political frustration, medical debt, challenging relationships, road rage, or our children are facing a problem we don't know how to solve, the amount of suffering that is a given and a part of what we deal on a day-to-day basis and just part of the deal of being alive, it's overwhelming. I really enjoy having meditation teachers on this show because they bring stories of how they feel like a dynamic character in their own story. They can change, they can grow, they can improve. Personal challenge, anger, or frustration mounts up, and they find a new tool they can use to wield their own mental state, and they use it to hone their approach to life over many decades. My guest on this episode is Mark Coleman, a British meditation teacher who has been practicing meditation for more than 3 decades. In the early pages of his book, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness, Mark describes being immersed in his own anger while shuffling around the punk scene of England. Now, if you know anything about me and my interest in music, you'll know that Mark's book hooked me then and there when he started talking about punk rock music. I couldn't help but ask him about his past in music and how that scene still resonates with him today. Just like my years spent heavily immersed in the music scene still resonates with me. From there, our conversation steers into a discussion of mindfulness, the misconceptions of the practice, learning how to take in the immediacy of each passing moment. Moments we'll never get back, mind you. And also some discussion around Mark's experiences with physical pain, a topic I know well from recent back and knee surgeries. Mark's new book, From Suffering to Peace, is out now from New World Library, one of the longest and strongest advocates of this show. I cannot thank them, the team there, enough for all they've done for me and continue to do for me, such as hooking me up with fantastic guests such as Mark. They've been helping me now for about 2 years, and I'm super grateful to them for their support. As for Mark Coleman, you can find him at markcoleman.org. That's Mark with a K. And you can find him on Twitter at the handle markcoleman365. You can follow me on Twitter at classical_ideas or at facebook.com/classicalideaspodcast. If you like this show, please consider rating the show on iTunes or visiting me at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. If you are a long-time listener or you're here for the first time, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I am grateful for your attention. So now, without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Mark Coleman. Mark Coleman, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thank you. Nice to be on your show.
Can you just briefly introduce yourself to the audience, however you see fit?
Yeah, so I am a meditation teacher. I've trained in the Buddhist tradition for the last 35 years. And I'm from England. I'm an insight meditation teacher based in California now. I'm also founder of the Mindfulness Training Institute, training teachers to share these mindfulness practices. And my passion and my love is to take people out into nature with a contemplative awareness. So my first book, Awake in the Wild, really explores how we can bring mindfulness and awareness into nature. And so I lead a whole series of retreats and trainings around the world, mostly on the west coast of the US. So my life is passionately involved around mindfulness and meditation and sharing these practices widely.
Excellent. Well, that's great. You can refer to any of your books throughout the conversation. The that we're mostly going to talk about today is your brand new one, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness, just out from New World Library. But I want to start back in time a little bit and talk about your youth, because you and I have something in common in that we both grew up sort of like in the punk rock scene. Before you became a meditation practitioner, you were a punk rocker. Do you have any favorite bands from back in the day?
Oh, many, many bands. The Clash, the Stranglers, Susie and the Banshees. I sort of came at the sort of the latter end of the punk explosion in London. So it was, the Jam, some what I call sort of in the post-punk genre, but also, some classic old English bands, Stiff Little Fingers and Damned, and then later bands like the Cramps. And so, yeah, it was a great time to be in London as a punk, and it was a wild scene back in the day.
Awesome. I'm a huge Damned fan. I love Wait for the Blackout on the Black Album. It's just so fantastic. And what's interesting is, speaking of the Jam, I lived in the town of Woking in Surrey, where Paul Weller's from. So that was a lot of fun. There was like a Paul Weller statue right in the middle of town, right by the train station.
That's funny.
Yeah, so, I've had a bunch of punk rockers on the show because, I gravitate towards punk rockers within this spiritual community. I've had Jimmy Yu from the hardcore band Judge. I've had Miguel Chen from Teenage Bottle Rocket, Chris Grasso from Occult Knife, and Ray Cappo from Shelter, Brad Warner from Zero Defects on the show. And these are all guys who have come out of the punk scene and turned to meditation, Buddhist meditation, Hindu practices, etc. So do you have a theory as to why punk rockers dig meditation?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've never really put it in that frame, but, the Buddha's teaching, he framed it as against the stream, and punk in its essence is very much against the stream, against mainstream norms, against sort of certain cultural, values. And so I think there's in both scenes, even though Buddhism presents itself as somewhat more, maybe conservative or traditional, actually its essence is quite radical, and it's really going against the norm of the culture, which is to consume and to, look outside yourself for happiness. And so I think there's something in both scenes. You get a certain kind of anti-establishment, slightly anarchic, rebellious quality in the monks that I've sat with in Asia, and also in the punk scene. So there's, I think, some dovetailing there.
Nice. You write in the book about, being living in a chaotic sort of life as a young punk kid, with your mohawk and just kind of feeling internal anger. What are your clearest memories of being that young punk kid and finding meditation for the first time? How did this transition occur?
Yeah, well, there I am in my white mohawk. I used to make my own clothes, and pretty kind of funky and out there. And I was squatting houses, and I had to be squatting a Buddhist housing association house. And being Buddhist, they didn't kick me out. They're like, you should go meditate, young man, and sort yourself out. So it just happened to be, so they had a meditation center around the corner from where I was squatting. And I walked in, and I remember this moment to the day. I walked in, and people, and there was nothing special happening. There wasn't a class happening. People were just, cleaning and working in the bookstore and making flowers, putting flowers on the altar and stuff. And people just had a sense of presence and dignity and clarity. And I'd come from a world where that was not the prevailing quality by any means. Mm. And then I went to one of the meditation classes, and as happens when you first start to meditate, I was busy blaming, judging, angry. I was in sort of, movements to try and stop the financial center, to shut it down, and demonstrations. And so I was very busy, raging against the machine. And I'd never really taken a hard look inside and wondering why I was so unhappy, inside. And so meditation really helped turn that lens of awareness to my own mind and heart and patterns and habits and reactions. And it was a wake up call of saying, oh, this is where I'm suffering. This is where so much of what I'm doing is causing my unhappiness. And so that moment totally grabbed me. And I've been looking and studying training for the last ever since these last 35 years.
So since you've been working with this, is that punk kid still in you? Like, do you retain some of the values, but like have managed to deal with things in a better way? Is that how you see it?
Well, I definitely relate to the anti-establishment, against the stream. I do feel very strong. And I went to a college that was very socialist. So I very much subscribe to those values and see the personal and collective pain that our current society and capitalist values, creating the massive inequality of wealth and harming the planet, etc. So I've always retained that sort of anti-establishment quality politically. Even though now people look at me and go, "How could you ever be a punk? You look so, so straight and just." It's I think the essence of that is what you hold in your heart.
Oh, for sure. And like I grew up to be a high school teacher, and I would go to work every day, and it's high. But I grew up listening to the Misfits and the Cro-Mags and all kinds of stuff like that, and it just kind of it's in you, despite what your outward appearance may look like. Awesome.
Right.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all those memories with me. I just love talking about stuff like that, especially because like I gravitated to that right in the beginning of the book. I was like, yes, a punk rocker. This is going to be awesome. So your brand new book, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness, is out now from my buds over at New World Library. I've had tons of guests on from them, and I love that publishing house. In the book, you say that if you ask 10 different teachers what mindfulness is, you will get 10 different answers. Well, I have one teacher, you, on the phone. So very, very briefly, what is your definition of mindfulness practice?
Well, the simple version, mindfulness is clear awareness. It's the simple knowing of what's happening as it's happening internally and externally. And my longer definition, it's the awareness of our physical, mental, emotional, and environmental experience with clarity, in service of understanding and insight. And I add that line, in service of understanding and insight, because one of the reasons I wrote the book is mindfulness has been reduced often, in its explosion in popularity, to attention or to focus. And from the context of the tradition, it's embedded within a path of practice, understanding, insight, freedom of the heart and mind. And so I wanted to make sure people were seeing and understanding mindfulness in its proper context, which is really a path of moving from suffering to peace, from suffering to freedom.
Yeah, I love how you wrote early in the book that the misconstrued understandings of mindfulness and the whole mindfulness explosion around the world right now convinced you to write about it. Is there anything else that we get wrong, or did you kind of define that pretty clearly?
Yes, all kinds of things we get wrong in that. Mindfulness that has been touted as the panacea for so many problems, right? And mindfulness is it's a powerful practice, tool, methodology, teaching, and like anything, it has its strengths and it has its limitations. And so when every week I hear some new research of mindfulness is good for weight loss or hair loss or sleep deprivation or whatever. And I'm like, well, maybe. And what's really important is that it's a tool to really understand the heart and mind and understand the human condition. And that's really what I care to help people see the significance of.
Do you see mindfulness as a secular or a religious practice, or maybe both?
Yeah, I guess. I don't hold a hard line division between those two, and I'm aware that being born in England, where there's less of a division between church and state, it's very strong here, at least in theory. And so, in the same way that I've been, a Buddhist meditation teacher, but I've also been a psychotherapist and a coach and a consultant. And people ask me, oh, well, how could you go from, being a Dharma teacher, meditation teacher, to therapy or to coaching? And I say, well, it's not like I stopped being, and I throw out my Dharma training of 30 years when I'm therapy or coaching, all of that is, embedded within me and is informing how I work. And so I feel the same with the spectrum of how mindfulness is taught. Mindfulness, of course, in a school situation with kids, kindergarten, high school, whatever, the Buddhist roots, for the most part, are left out, partly because of that need to separate church and state. And at the same time, it's a continuum in the same way that you might go to a Buddhist center and learn a meditation class, and it's may not look that different than if you're learning mindfulness at work, but because it's the beginning is it's a slow on ramp, and then over time, I think the difference is where is in the depth. If you're learning mindfulness in a traditional setting, you will start with mindfulness of breath and very simple attention to various parts of your experience, but the point is to really understand and have deep insight into the human condition and the nature of reality, whereas a more secular class will stop more at basic awareness of, say, mind and body, and not have that whole contextual framework. So I just see it as a continuum from shallow to deep. And one of the things I do appreciate about how mindfulness has grown is that it is allowing people an entry point that they wouldn't have necessarily found. There's a big leap to go from your office to a Buddhist retreat center in the woods, right? But it's not such a big jump to go from a lunchtime class offered in your company to then checking out an introductory class at a center and then going on a silent retreat.
Nice. Well, you sort of mentioned something interesting that intrigues me, and that's the use of meditation and mindfulness practices in like corporate offices or in schools or in prisons or in psychotherapy sessions. What have been some of your favorite positive developments in the field in the last several years?
In the corporate space, or in generally in
schools, in corporate spaces? Like, what do you see as being like some of your wow, that is so impressive, I'm so glad that was used there?
Yeah, well, so I've been teaching in places like the UN. I was teaching in Senegal for regional and country directors for the World Food Aid Program. And so there's a lot of work now being done taking these practices to aid workers, to relief workers, particularly people working in war-torn countries. I have a friend who's developed multiple programs through different UN agencies, and it's being taught in Uzbekistan and in the Congo and in Libya and Afghanistan, where people are really on the front line of very, very painful, difficult war situations. So that's one example. I've friends, and I've also done this myself, of bringing mindfulness into prisons and into juvenile justice system, and giving people these liberating practices while they're often living in pretty wretched conditions. So I just see the practices being taken out into places where there's a lot of suffering, immigration shelters, and now there's a whole wave of trauma-sensitive mindfulness where these practices are being more subtly refined to work with populations who've been traumatized, whether it's sexually or psychologically, trauma from combat. I've done a lot of work with veterans. So it's really, so what I appreciate about it is, the Buddha taught these practices as a way to relieve suffering. And so because of the popularizing or the secularizing, then these practices have much more, easy access into the VA, for example, into the Veteran Administration, or to kindergarten, or to, now I have friends who are teaching this in hospice. So that, there's a huge spectrum of human suffering, and there's barely a place that I don't see these practices being offered and bringing some relief.
Excellent. Well, I mean, and if the methods work, I mean, think about all the people who are currently suffering, whether it's like, in school or in prison or in therapy, that, maybe it'll work for them. So it's always worth a try. It's fascinating.
Right.
There's a book I read recently called Prescribing the Dharma by a psychotherapist named Dr. Ira Helderman. And he writes a lot about how it's being used as a spectrum within the psychotherapy field. And it's just so interesting. So
Fascinating.
yeah, so you mentioned a moment ago as well about like the path to like going on silent retreats. And so I've had a practice for the past several years that I've tried to maintain, and I go on and off the wagon. I've never done a silent retreat though for more than a single day. And I feel like that could help me break through in a practice. So for anyone doing a practice of some kind and they maybe feel plateaued, how important do you feel the silent retreat could possibly be for them?
Yeah, so silent retreats have been part of the tradition for thousands of years, and there's good reasons for that. And certainly, any teacher who's teaching has trained well has been probably done extensive silent retreat as I have done and my colleagues have done. And there's only so much that one can do in a daily practice. Mostly, and a daily practice is important and helpful to develop, a continuity of mindfulness practice. And but when we go on retreat, then we have the supportive conditions where we can unplug, literally digitally, but also from our lives and roles and responsibilities. And we can immerse ourselves much more deeply into meditation, and the silence is a tremendous support for that. And there's a way that we can develop samadhi, which is this balanced, unified quality of attention, and the depth just opens up infinitely. And so with that, with the calm and the clarity that comes from being in a retreat setting, then of course with that clarity, then there's much more capacity for insight, for understanding, for letting go, and really seeing more deeply our habits, our conditioning, and the human condition, and finding ways to free ourselves from the ways that we suffer unnecessarily. So I would say for anybody who's starting or been practicing for a while, that if you haven't done a silent retreat, then that they're pretty available, at least in the States, all over. And try a weekend, try 5 days or a week. They might sound intimidating because silent, how could they be silent for a week? But actually the silence piece is the easy part. And it's actually a very beautiful, rich, delicious dive into some depth, stillness, and they're profound. They're life-changing for people.
And the range of suffering. So we think about this term, and I know that it's defined differently by different people, but you'd also think about something like unsatisfactoriness, right?
Yes.
Okay, so whenever I'm thinking about this term, I think about like the daily banalities that plague us all. So I like in meditation and practice to almost trying to like develop a superpower and taking control of myself and taking that control to like a new level. So I see a lot of people who are like out of control, like they tailgate, they drive erratically, they yell at their kids over dumb stuff, maybe like slam cabinets at home. And like I've seen a lot of people say things like, well, I guess I have to do everything around here, and they're in these states of emotional distress so much of their life, and they're doing things that are like unhelpful or maybe somewhat dangerous. So I see like a practice of meditation as like helping to cultivate the ability of being able to have things happen to you and choosing to respond in the moment in ways that are helpful instead of unhelpful. Do you see this like superpower analogy as being somewhat accurate in your view?
Yes, and maybe.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if I'm not sure if I'd use the word superpower. It certainly is an amazing quality and tremendously helpful. And I think the reason why it's mindfulness becomes so popular is because we're living in times where, the pace of life is incredibly fast. There's high stress levels. We're, addicted and consumed by technology.
Yes.
And our attention is pulled every which way. And as a society and as a culture, we haven't really done much to support people training their minds and finding calm and clarity and stillness and presence. And so in that way, you could say it's a superpower in that it's giving people this gift or this tool of and set of techniques and ways to focus, understand ourselves, develop clarity, find ease in the midst of stuff. And particularly, one of the jewels that this teaching offers is to see how that we add to our suffering, how through our reaction, our avoidance, or our judgment, we create so much unnecessary suffering. And that's really such a great liberating tool.
Fantastic. Well, and I want to talk about something positive as well. So despite all those, those irritations, another thing that you write about is experiencing the immediacy of each moment through a meditation and mindfulness practice. And I think about things that give me great pleasure, like going to see live music or riding a bike or like drinking a beer from a microbrewery or reading a book or just playing a board game on the floor with my daughter. How do you think that doing a mindfulness practice can help us enjoy the good things in our life instead of just like dealing with the negative irritations?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because it's true that, Buddhists particularly can definitely orient more toward the suffering and the stress and the struggle. But as I was teaching a course up in Portland yesterday, and I was having students go and have a mindful lunch, which means actually pay attention to your food rather than looking at your phone or talking or driving or whatever. And he came back and said, "Oh wow, that lunch was amazing." And I said, "Well, was it any different than yesterday's lunch?" No, it was exactly the same, but I just was present for it. And I talk a lot about how much joy mindfulness brings, in that we live on an amazing planet with amazing people and a lot of beauty around. There's also a lot of suffering around, but there's also a lot of beauty. It's summer right now, and trees, flowers blooming, and so when we're mindful, we have much more ability to be present, and therefore, if we're present, we can much more able to appreciate, whether it's playing with your children, or taking a walk in the woods, or listening to music, or any number of things. My experience is I have tremendous access to joy and appreciation and gratitude and happiness and well-being. And, those are beautiful qualities, and especially because we live in times where there's so much stress, so much anxiety. If we can be mindful enough to actually enjoy what is here, whether it's nature or beauty or people or whatever, then it's a tremendous source of happiness and well-being, and also resilience. In these times we need a lot of resilience, and if we're not able to enjoy and feel pleasure and appreciation and gratitude, then we're not really supporting ourselves to sustain ourselves. So I think of mindfulness as an inner sustainability practice. There's a lot of talk about outer sustainability right now, but actually it gives us the tools to be inwardly sustainable.
Nice. Well, speaking of resilience, you and I not only have a background in the punk rock scene in common, but we also have chronic back pain in common, in which we have to be resilient. So I had back surgery in 2017, and I had knee surgery in 2015, and my body has never been the way it was, and it will never be what it was again. And that is just something that I'm just working with. Can you tell me about your back problems, how you've worked with it instead of against it in relation to your mindfulness and meditation practice? How does that help you with pain management and, living your best life despite any limitations?
Yeah, well, sorry to hear about your back pain. That never is a pleasant thing. And
never.
Yes, I've had, various years of dealing with chronic back pain and spasms and, often moves around the back, but basically And, so I talk a lot in the book about how mindfulness, helps us work with difficulty, particularly with the body, whether it's aging or sickness or physical pain. Mostly when we experience something we don't like pain, we try to avoid it, run away from it, judge it, blame it, hate it, contract around it. And of course, all of that movement is just causing unnecessary or additional suffering. And so mindfulness, this is what I think is an interesting contrast to how mindfulness is portrayed. Mindfulness is actually a radical confrontation, meeting life as it is. And sometimes that means meeting physical pain, emotional challenges, difficult life circumstances. And it gives us the ability to simply face and meet and open to and acknowledge what's here without adding extra layers of struggle, resistance, suffering, blame. And so when we do that, we develop this quality of equanimity, which is the ability to meet experience with some balance. We still don't necessarily like it or want it, but we're not suffering in the same way in our mind. So there's a simple equation that many people speak to that I write in the book. Suffering equals pain times resistance, right? So pain is inevitable, physical pain, emotional pain, but the suffering depends on how we relate to it, whether we're struggling, fighting, resisting, and physical pain is a really easy example. If we have physical pain, like the back's hurting, the knee-jerk response is to not like it, not want it, and to contract. And of course, when we contract the body around the pain, it just makes it worse. If we can actually notice the pain, feel the unpleasant sensations, relax around it, it doesn't make the pain go away, but it creates more ease in the body, which gives us more capacity to deal with it.
Say you're sitting in meditation and your back is spasming as you're sitting. What is your internal monologue saying to you?
The monologue is, there's the back pain again. And then notice the sensations, all right, twinging, tightening, burning, stabbing. And then can you, so I'm, sometimes there's like a voice of a meditation coach. And so often that's nonverbal, but I'm just going to verbalize it for your listeners. So the coach would be, okay, take a couple of breaths, soften around it, soften into it, lean into it, and bring some loving kindness to it. And so the orientation is really around how much softening can I create around it or with it to not be adding fuel onto the fire.
That actually makes me feel a little better just listening to that for 20 seconds.
And then also noticing, everything's transient, right? So
yeah.
So noticing this thing that I monolithically call pain, back pain, right? It's actually just a variety of moving, changing sensations. And when I track that, when I track the impermanent nature of it, it's like, okay, so it's there, but it's not always there, and it's changing, and other things call my attention. And I have the freedom of awareness to be able to move my attention wherever. So sometimes I'll be with it because that's what's necessary to lean into it. Other times it's really skillful to shift the attention away, to actually get up from the meditation, or to look outside, or to align the attention to some other experience that allows ease in the mind and the heart and the body. And so mindfulness gives us the understanding that we have a lot of freedom in our awareness to direct the attention.
Excellent. Well, something else that strikes me is that a lot of people who are listening might think that since you are like over 3 decades into a regular practice, that nothing bugs you. So I think that's a misconception. So I'm curious about what pushes your buttons, what pushes your abilities, and what still challenges you.
Yeah, well, I would say the number one source of my irritation is my computer.
Okay.
Which I spend a lot of time on. And I'm not the most tech savvy of people. And so just there is definitely grounds for some irritation, whether it's not being able to find a file or something loading interminably slowly or, just, needing to buy something and going somewhere and I need a password and I can't find the password. And then, just the sort of the endless little, I get more, I find I get more triggered by the small things. The bigger things in life, I'm like, it's like all the ways that I've trained to surrender and let go seem much more accessible. But it's the small things, like the interminable amount of time on the computer finding things, and the email, the relentless email inbox. That I find. I can definitely feel resistance. And of course, I know when I'm feeling that kind of resistance, I'm actually making it worse. But, it's, so it's, we all have our places that are triggering.
Yeah.
And so, I noticed that and then breathe, get up, take a walk, have a cup of tea. And, so it's, of course, we're human and there's places that are going to annoy us. And, of course, relationship is always a great place to practice. Right? There's always ways that one's family, partners, kids, push buttons. And so that's always as Ram Dass would say, if you think you're enlightened, go live with your family for a week.
Yeah. Well, and something else like that jumps out at me is chapter 10 specifically in the book was something that I really latched onto because it's about the ceaseless conjuring of reality and like what is versus what isn't. And I have a quote from the book here that I want to read really quick, and it reads, "The world we live in is real. But what we see, think, and believe does not necessarily reflect what is so. We see life through a range of conditioning, bias, and projectives. And what we make of experience is affected and often distorted by influences from our past, as well as from the views of family, friends, culture, society, and religion." Now, I can't really pinpoint why precisely this quote resonated so much with me, but I was curious if you can discuss how we can recognize when we are conjuring what isn't versus when we should actually feel aggrieved or angry about certain situations. Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Well, this is, again, this is I think, a really rich area of exploration, and where as we cultivate mindfulness, self-awareness, we begin to see the layers that we bring to experience that may not necessarily be helpful or accurate. So, there's a line from the Buddha where he says something like, "That which we conceive is ever other than is so." And so, for example, and this is, I think, happens the most in human relationships. Maybe we come to work and we're walking into a meeting and somebody gives us a, sort of a slightly unfriendly look. And we immediately interpret that as, oh, they don't like me, I've done something wrong, maybe they're angry, and then we start, tracking all the things that we might have done or said or didn't do that may have upset this person, particularly if they're in a, position of authority. And so we create this whole drama, and it may just be that person that morning who's feeling a little grumpy, didn't sleep well, has back pain, is stressed about their kids' graduation that day, and it's got completely nothing to do with us. But we run a story that ends up being quite painful about, what we did wrong, we're not good enough, and, maybe our position's at threat. And so we create this whole web of drama and sometimes catastrophe in a way that's very unnecessary, that's very energy consuming, and is mostly an illusion. And so we do that all the time in relationship. We do that with we do that with our mind, with our physical condition. And so, where mindfulness is so helpful is it helps reveal the storytelling mind, the interpreting mind, the projecting mind, the comparing mind, and we see that it's mostly fabricated. And when we believe the fabrication in this world, it's often quite distressing. So awareness helps cut through that in a way that can bring a lot of relief. So that the classic example is the way the mind catastrophizes, right? Maybe we have a twinging sensation in your back when you're meditating this morning, and maybe you've got a big day at work or you're traveling, and our mind suddenly spins this whole story about how horrible the day is going to be, and you're not going to be able to travel, and you might need a wheelchair to be wheeled through the airport, and all of that drama. And then, you get up and you do some stretching, and then that particular physical pain wanes. It's like, okay, so that was a whole lot of pain and suffering and anxiety and fear about the future based on a reality that's actually just made up in my head.
Oh, the storytelling we tell ourselves, it's one of the most difficult parts of being alive, I think.
Yeah, and it's one of the it's what the mind loves to do well. The brain is an anticipating storytelling machine. That we can create. It's a way we create meaning of the world, and it's also a way we create a story that's not necessarily true. And so, one of the main differences I see with someone who's meditated and has a practice is that there's over time, there's an ability to cut through that level of story, to not buy into the stories and the dramas, and therefore, have that spaciousness to see, here's a bunch of thoughts that my mind is spinning, and it's not necessarily how life is, and it just cuts through a whole level of unnecessary suffering.
Well, Mark, I'm loving this book. It's got so many fantastic practical tools and things that people can do in their own lives if they're looking to start trying something, as well as some new ideas that maybe people who have a practice haven't looked at before. Where can listeners find you if they want to follow your work?
Sure. So easiest place is to go to my website, markcoleman.org. That's Mark with a K, Coleman, Coleman.org, and you'll find information there about my retreats, my other books. I run mindfulness teacher trainings. I run meditation and nature teacher trainings, and particularly offer these nature-based retreats all over the country. And so, just go to markcoleman.org and you'll find all of it there.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, you should check out Mark's new book, From Suffering to Peace, out now from New World Library, and I'm really enjoying it, and I'm so grateful to you for spending some time with me this morning.
Great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.